Welcome to today's webinar, An Outward Mindset, How Anyone Can Change Their Organization, brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed in a listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Samantha with NCSL. Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Samantha Nectarline, and I lead the Young and New Professionals program with NCSL. I am pleased to introduce to you today Patrick Sullivan, the Director of the Montana State Professional Development Center. Patrick received his Doctor of Public Administration from the University of Southern California and has worked for a variety of agencies throughout his career, but most recently was the Director of the MPA program at Southern Arkansas University. This presentation is available for download during the webinar. It can be accessed via the media library, which is the play button in the upper right-hand corner next to the telephone. This webinar will be archived within 1 week. Please go to ncsl.org/webinars to access this presentation. You can ask a question at any time by entering it into the box located on the lower left-hand side of the screen. Thank you, and I'm pleased to hand it over to Patrick Sullivan.
So welcome, everybody, and again, good afternoon to most of you, and still good morning to some of you who happen to be on the West Coast. I'm really pleased to talk to you today about the outward mindset and how anybody can change the organization. I'm actually kind of excited about this material. We've been presenting it to state employees for a little while now. This is material that comes from the Arbinger Institute. They are out of Salt Lake City. It's based on a book that was called Leadership and Self-Deception, if you're interested in more information. So one of the things that we start off with is comparing an inward mindset to an outward mindset. So if you look at the chart there on the slide, you can see on the left-hand side the inward mindset organization, and you can see how the triangles are pointing inward, and the individuals are focused on their own results, whereas the outward mindset organization has the triangles pointing outward away from the images of the people, suggesting that they're looking at the group's results and looking beyond their own things. A mindset is how we see pretty much everything, how we see people, how we see our challenges, opportunities, circumstances, and so forth. If we have an outward mindset, if you look at the chart there, how I see, especially in the organization, the mindset directs those behaviors. And so what I do comes out of my mindsets. The objectives I'm trying to accomplish and the things I do to accomplish those objectives are what our behaviors are directed at. So we're going to use this shape of a triangle to represent our objectives and the things that we do. Even when behaviors are the same, the focus and motivation in each mindset is different. So we reverse the direction of the triangle to show this difference for the inward mindset. Notice that the objectives are pointed back toward me. So when we want to be more specific about what the outward and inward mindsets are all about, in the outward mindset, others in the organization especially matter like I matter. And so you can see others' objectives, their issues, the things that they're trying to accomplish, they matter to me. By contrast, in the inward mindset, others unfortunately don't matter like I do. In fact, if their issues, their objectives and so forth, they don't matter much to me at all. So much so that we actually don't see them. This means, unfortunately, that I see other people as objects. And this is one of the things that I find most people have a really hard time with. They have a hard time believing that they view other human beings as objects. But if you consider these possibilities, for example, when my mindset is inward, I see others in terms of how they are impacting me. And then they can, if they're helpful, for example, I see others as vehicles. If they make things harder for me, I see them as obstacles. If their help wouldn't matter to me at all, I see them as irrelevancies. And then one way to capture the core difference between these mindsets is to think about how the mindset changes. So again, just to back up a little bit, if you look at those terms, vehicles, irrelevancies, obstacles, those are all things. Those are objects. Those aren't people. Okay? So how do we get there? How do we end up with an inward mindset? Well, let's just track through a scenario. Suppose I notice that my coworker, we'll give the name Jack, would benefit from some information that I have. Okay? So my sense in the outward mindset is to be helpful. Okay? So if I honor that sense, I say, yes, this is something that I should do. What is it that I would think to do? And the answer, of course, is that I would share the information. What happens if I don't share the information? And the interesting thing here is that it doesn't matter the reason for my not sharing the information. What matters is what happens next. What happens next is what we're going to call a self-betrayal. So I had the desire or the sense to share the information, but I don't, okay? So then I need to be justified for not doing what I had the sense or the desire to do, okay? We call this choice of justification, so forth, the self-betrayal. That's the point of self-betrayal. An interesting thing about this sense, and we'll track this out a little bit more. So I should share the information with my colleague. If I have the outward mindset, of course, I honor that sense. But if I betray myself, let's think about what happens when I betray that sense. What goes on next? Well, the first thing that we would consider is, how do you suppose you might start seeing your colleague? Okay. Well, maybe I would see this person as not as effective as they should be. Why would I have the information and they don't? Maybe incompetent, maybe lazy. There's any number of things that we might associate with them to justify our actions. And at the same time, how would I start to see myself? Well, I might say, well, I'm a harder worker. How come I'm more resourceful than my colleague Jack? I don't want to be an enabler. I don't want to always have to help this person out. And the interesting thing about this, by the way, Jack hasn't done anything yet, but this process is happening in our own minds. And this happens very quickly, by the way. It's not something that you would necessarily be conscious of, but it's a place to go to kind of protect ourselves when we betray the sense of doing what we know we should do. But once I go there and I go through this process of seeing my colleague a certain way and seeing myself a certain way, are they really still a person to me? Well, at this point, I'd say no, they're not a person to me. They've actually become an object. And again, think back to how this scenario works out. Can you see where Jack might be seen as a vehicle or more, maybe even an irrelevancy, maybe an obstacle, because of this process of justification? So do these thoughts and feelings about my colleague and about myself, do you suppose they invite me to go back and to do what I originally felt I should do? And of course the answer is no, that they wouldn't invite me to go back. In fact, it's very unlikely at this point that I would go and do what I was supposed to do. But what do they do for me? Why did this process of seeing my colleague the way I do and seeing myself the way I do, what does that do for me? Well, what it does is it justifies my not doing it. And what this is associated with, by the way, is this really compelling need for all human beings, and that's our need to be right. It's so important to us to be right that we go through this process of justification even when we're wrong sometimes. So when I betray my outward sensibility toward others, I need to feel justified. And this justification becomes really, really important to us. So what does this inward mindset now invite in others? I find this actually the more fascinating part of this process. So let's suppose, by the way, when I do this justification, I go into what we call a box, okay? In other words, this is how I identify myself in relation to the other person in this box. So let's suppose that I'm in this box toward my colleague Jack, because I've decided these things about Jack. So what happens? I see Jack in a certain way, and remember what that is. I see Jack as maybe incompetent, maybe lazy, maybe inefficient, whatever those terms are that I use in my justification. But because of that, because I see him in a certain way, in that way as an object, I do certain things. Maybe I blame Jack for things. Maybe I avoid Jack. Maybe because of my thoughts about Jack, and he didn't have the resourcefulness to have that information to begin with, and so I act on that. So what happens in turn, it's likely that this person also carries around his own boxes, that he's done his own justifications and starts to see me, okay? So what's likely to happen if my blame is threatening the box that he's carrying? Or even without that, he starts to see my behaviors. And so he looks and says, okay, now he's seeing me as an object. And when he sees me as an object, then he's going to act accordingly. And he's going to do whatever he does based on what he's seeing in me. Now think about this. If he's looking at me and seeing my behaviors, he's seeing me maybe being standoffish, maybe avoiding him, maybe not, or not sharing it. Can you see where he might say, oh, wow, that person's not much of a team player. He's kind of stuck up. He's kind of, what's going on when he's avoiding me? And so what's he likely to do? Isn't he likely to also blame me for his problems? Maybe he's also going to say, well, I don't know if I want to have much to do with this individual because look at his behaviors. And what happens over time is these things are repeated. So we keep reinforcing it. The great irony here is if you think about it, what the other person ends up doing is the very thing that I didn't want them to do to begin with. And so I'm encouraging the behaviors of being not a team player, of not being efficient, of not being collaborative or anything like that. I've actually encouraged that kind of behavior. And so what happens here is we're engaged in what we call a collusion. And this collusion is where a conflict between parties invites the very things they complain about. And what drives this is this need to be justified. So each one of us now are looking for this justification to carry out our behaviors, to not do what we're supposed to do. And then the next step, of course, we're never satisfied with this. And part of it is because we have a little bit of uneasiness about how we've betrayed ourselves, and we want to preserve the justification. So what do? We seek out allies. So can you imagine that now I go and tell other people, that Jack, he's not much of a team player, is it? Or actually one of my favorites, I do consulting work with hundreds of organizations over time. And my favorite is when I hear people say about some others that they work with, I don't know what he does, or I don't know what she does. Well, we know what the message is in there. The message is, I don't think they do much, and they certainly don't do as much as I do. And that's how we recruit allies, as we say those kinds of things about another person. And well, you can well imagine at the same time, the other person, Jack, is also recruiting allies. And so now, and we can't figure out, by the way, where these clicks come from. Well, this is where they come from. But remember what's driving this. What's driving this was the original justification. And once we start down this road of justification, we're going to keep adding justifications on top of it. Okay? And now what happens is these two groups get into their own boxes. And so now the organization, the people we work with all the time, we view one another, view the other in certain ways, again, all driven by this need to be justified, and more importantly, by this need to be right. And this is something, by the way, that we all have. We all have a need to be right. So I want you to listen to Jim Farrow now. He's going to describe a story of a father and his son. And in the story, I want you to listen for the justification and for this need to be right. Hello, Jim.
Some years ago now, there was a gentleman who came through one of our courses, and he told us some years ago now, there was a gentleman who came through one of our courses, and he told us a story about his boy, and he says, I'm so bothered about this kid. He's 16. I don't trust him. He's got friends I don't like. He's making poor decisions. And he says, just 2 weeks ago, he asked, it was a Friday, and he asked if he could borrow the car. Well, I didn't want to lend it to him, he said, but I also didn't want to seem like I was just mean-spirited. So what occurred to me in the moment was I'll attach some really early curfew time for a Friday night that he couldn't possibly accept. So what he said was, this father, he said, okay, you can borrow the car if you're home by 10:30. Okay, look, we've all been 16 before. How hard is this, actually, right? So of course, the boy says, yeah, sure, Dad. Takes the keys, and he's out the door. And the one thing Dad knows for sure, he said at this point, is he's not going to be home by 10:30. And that just made him all the more upset. And he stewed over this all night long, and thinking about all the problems that his son has. And particularly as it started to get close to the bottom of the 10:30 hour, he kept checking his watch frequently, until finally he resolved within himself, he says, this is it. It's the line in the sand. He's never going to use the car again. That's it. And no sooner had he resolved that within himself than he heard a squeal of tires into the driveway. He looks at his watch. 10:29. His son had made it. Now here's the question. Do you think this father was happy?
So what do you think? Was the father going to be happy? Probably not, right? And so there's a opportunity here, but what do you suppose happens? Let's listen again and see what happens in the second part of the video. What does the father do?
What had he been doing all night long? He'd been blaming his boy, right? And so in order to be justified for blaming his boy, what did he need? What had he been doing all night long? He'd been blaming his boy, right? And so in order to be justified for blaming his boy, what did he need most? He needed a boy who was blameworthy, right? So now let's think about this. Let's get creative for a moment, because although the boy got home at 10:29, there still are some ways that we could make him out to be wrong in this story, right? Let's think about a few. Couldn't he say, grill him about squealing the tires, for example? Responsible kids don't do that. How about filling the car up with gas? Did we do it? Right? How about, you probably had to speed to get home, didn't you? Right? I mean, there are a number of ways he could grill his boy. He chose a fourth way. This boy comes in, 10:29, and says, made it, Dad. And this had the potential to be an amazingly beautiful moment, a healing moment, right? But we tend not to have healing moments when we're driven by a need to be justified. So what the father said was, he said, "You sure cut it close, didn't you?" Right? You sure cut it close. Well, there's a tremendous cost that comes with this issue of justification. One of those costs is this. When we have a need to be justified, we actually value problems more than solutions, and we value conflict over peace.
So what was the father putting at risk? Certainly he's putting at risk the relationship with his son. He's putting trust at risk, and all driven by what? All driven by this need to be justified. Okay? The whole idea here is that the father could have congratulated the son, gotten out of the box. He could have said, wow, good for you. I appreciate you making all that effort. This was not an easy thing. Let me go back a little bit. So it was not an easy thing for the son to do. I mean, anybody that's been that age would know. 10:30 on a Friday night, pretty tough. And yet the dad didn't do that. And again, I want you to pay attention to what was driving it. What was driving it was what the father was essentially developing in his own mind without the son ever having done anything. He's decided in advance through his justification process that the son was going to misbehave. That somehow, if I'm going to hold something against the son, I have to have a reason. I'm going to find fault, then I have to find some reasons to find fault. And so instead of being able to see an opportunity for improving the relationship, the justification becomes more important. The interesting thing about justifications, by the way, is that they actually become more important to us than either success or even our relationships, or sometimes even our happiness. That this need to be right becomes paramount. And so that's what was going on with the dad. So how do we get out of the box? How do we avoid this? How do we not operate from this inward mindset that we've been talking about? Well, we can't waste our time trying to change others. That pretty much never works. And the problem with looking at changing others is that we'll find that all of us are sitting around waiting for the other person to change before we change ourselves. Maybe I'll do my best to cope with others, so I'll just put up with their behaviors. But really, is that what's going on? Because remember, in the scenario we laid out for you, Jack hadn't done anything. So who is it that I'm really coping with? And what's really going on here? Well, maybe because I'm so fed up with my colleagues, and that doesn't necessarily mean leaving your job altogether, but maybe I'll just leave the relationship. So I'm going to ignore these other people because I see them in the way that I've created through my justification, through the box that I'm living in. Maybe I'll try this communicating thing. Now, I've done a lot of interventions for conflicts over the years in organizations, and invariably the people that call me and say, well, we just need to improve our communication. Really, is that what you need? Isn't it really the relationship you need to improve? And communication means a whole bunch of things. And unfortunately, people think that there's this magic formula that we'll just tell other people what's going on, what bothered us, and that will fix it. Probably not, because we're really not getting to the basic issue, and the basic issue is about our relationship. Maybe I'll come up with some new skill, some new technique. Okay, well, in the future, what we'll do is we'll create a central location for information that we'll share, so that I'll make sure that that if Jack wants this information, he can find it there, and that will solve the problem. Well, it won't really, because the justification has already created an impression of this other person that is not entirely true. But it will cause me to still behave toward him in the way I was before, and his response will be this ongoing collusion. Maybe I'll change my own behavior. Oh, okay, so I'll just start doing things differently. And out of the blue, now I'll start sharing information and resources with Jack. Really? How is that going to work? Because it won't take but 1 or 2 times for Jack to not respond in kind, to not respond in the way that I want him to respond, before I give up on that. You see, I knew there was a problem there. I knew he wasn't a team player, because as soon as I changed my behavior, he didn't do anything. Well, it's not going to work again, because I needed to change only the behavior, and I only had tried to change the behaviors involved, and I didn't do anything about my mindset. So none of these changes that we list above have anything to do with changing my mindset. And here's what we know, that if I don't change my mindset, the way I view others around me, the way I view our objectives, the way I view our challenges, that even if I change my behaviors, over a short period of time, my behaviors will go back to reflect the mindset that I have. So again, put this in the context of the inward versus the outward mindset. If I stay with an inward mindset, then I'm only seeing my objectives. And if I'm only seeing my objectives, then what happens is, even though I try to communicate more, even though I try to cope with others, even though I try to change my behaviors, the same thing that got me there is still going on. And so I'm setting myself up essentially for what we would consider failure. So we can change the mindset and the behavior by applying the mindset, the outward mindset diagram. Okay, so this is, I don't want you to think this is hopeless. It is something that we can do. And I can caution you that I'm giving you the Reader's Digest view of this material, because ordinarily this involves a 2-day workshop to get people to understand how they can change to an outward mindset. So how do we shift to an outward mindset? So with whom do I want to improve things? We would start there. Okay? And so what are they wanting or trying to do? So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to see them. And I'm going to consider this person's objectives and the challenges, trials, burdens, and pains they are dealing with, past or present. How am I going to do that? Well, the way I'm going to do that is actually pretty simple. How about ask? So what we're suggesting here is that you would do what we call a meet to get. And for some people at first, this will kind of throw them off, that they'll be surprised that you're having this conversation with them, because it's not a conversation we typically have. And so you would sit down with a person, and I would recommend, a particular kind of phrasing. So this is a person that I want to improve things with. So I sit down and I say, I realized that I don't know as much about your job, the objectives, challenges, headaches, and so forth that you have, and that's not your fault, it's mine. So can you tell me more about your objectives, more about what you're trying to accomplish, and even more about your headaches and your challenges and so forth. And again, at first the person might be a little suspicious, but if you stay in that place, you say, I am really curious, and the conversation continues on that vein. Because the temptation is going to be, when you have this conversation, to immediately start telling them what they should do. You have to resist that temptation, and all you're going to do in this scenario is learn more about their objectives and their challenges and so forth. And you're not even going to propose any solutions on your part during the conversation, because what you're going to do is go to the next step and sit down and ask yourself honestly, how have I been a problem for this person? How have I gotten in their way? How have I added to their challenges, their trials, their burdens, or their pains? How have I not been as helpful as I could be? Okay. Think of ways, large, medium-sized, small, doesn't matter, that maybe I have mistreated or neglected this person. And if we go back to our scenario with Jack, think about, we're going to have this conversation with Jack because we went into this box with him. We went through this self-betrayal and this justification. And in order to get rid of that, we're going to have to go sit down with Jack and say, now listen, as I suggested, I don't know enough about what's going on with you, and I really want to know more. And then you say, oh, well, you know, one of the ways I've gotten in their way is I've not shared information. In fact, never even had a conversation about how we should share information, and perhaps that might be something I could do. And realistically, if you talk about mistreating a person, can you think about how, boy, when I talk to others about this person, in that negative sense, I start gathering allies, that perhaps I am causing harm to that. I really am mistreating the other person, and realize that this was just about my justification and not really anything they were doing. How can I be more helpful? And so you'd actually start trying to turn this around. One of the folks that gives a video through Arbinger talks about how he felt he was being neglected by his boss, that she was unreasonable, she wasn't using his skills very much, and really believed that. And then all of a sudden his boss's boss calls him in and says, you know what, we're not getting enough out of you. And he was horrified. But he went home that night, and once he got over the shock, he started to make a list. And on one side of the list, he listed the things where he wasn't very helpful, where he was getting in the way, where kinds of things he was doing were harmful. But then on the other side of this piece of paper, he started to make a list of ways that he could be more helpful. And that list was much longer than the first list. And so you can see that this is kind of a brainstorming exercise that a person needs to go through. But the idea here is, if we've been living in that world of justification, these are the very things we would not have been thinking about. They're not the things that would have occurred to us to do. And then once we've done that, then we go back to them and say, okay, thinking about what you've told me, thinking about your challenges and so forth, I've been considering ways that I could be more helpful. And then you would actually present these. I mean, think about it from the other person's perspective for a second. If you just went up to a person and say, how can I be more helpful? How do you think that would go? First of all, given your relationship that you had before in the collusion, I would argue it probably wouldn't go very well. Or you would get a deer in the headlights kind of look right back at you and say, well, what are you talking about? They wouldn't have anything. And besides, why would they know what you could do to be more helpful? But instead, if you're offering and saying, okay, these are the ways I think I can be more helpful. And then later on, they say, okay, maybe they pick from your list. So yeah, these things would be very helpful. So maybe if we have a way of getting together once or twice a week to talk about information each one of us has come in contact with that will be useful for the other person. So we'll make it a regular pattern. Oh yeah, that'd be a good idea. Maybe that's what they would say. But it can't stop there. So then we would make sure that we check in with that person after that on a fairly regular basis to say, you know what, were they helpful or not? Did this actually work? Because sometimes what we think will be helpful, at first, it really turns out not to be. And so this can be a really healthy conversation so that they say, oh, well, yeah, it was okay, but we really don't need to do that twice a week. Can we just do it once a week? Or how about if we just have a message board that we'll have available for all of us, and so you don't have to actually go through the process of meeting with anybody. We'll just have this regular posting, and you can put information you came across that might be helpful to anybody, and then we'll just review that. So you can see how this would work. What this does is it initiates a creative process and, more importantly, a collaborative process. The whole idea being that we want to change the behaviors. I'm not going to, let me just finish up with a couple of other things. We want to make sure that we understand because I can anticipate one of the questions coming up, and I want to address that before it even comes up. Most people say, well, gosh, what if I go to do that and the other person remains inward? What happens then? Well, here's the deal. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're the one that makes the attempt, the effort to pay attention to their objectives, to pay attention to their needs. And that alone changes the relationship. That alone breaks the collusion. And maybe the other person will stay the way they are, and maybe not. But the circumstance will change. Louise Francesconi, who is an executive with Raytheon, talks about how she was in a collusion and that this thing had gone on for years and she had allies, and that when she realized that she was in a collusion and she changed her behavior, she says openly, I don't think he changed, but I know I did, and I can guarantee you he knows when I changed. And that's the bottom line, really. The idea being that you don't have to worry about whether or not the other person changes, because the only behavior you have control over is your own. And what I have observed when this has been implemented, when people have tried this, that other people around them do sit up and take notice. They wonder what's going on. Why is this person so positive and so helpful? And they want to learn more about it. And so it does bring about change. We don't have to wait for the rest of the organization to change or anybody else to change, just ourselves, and adjust the whole picture. So I wanted to give plenty of time for question and answer because there's a lot in there in a short amount of time, and I want to make sure that people have a chance to clarify what this is about. And I certainly invite you to look for the book, Leadership and Self-Perception. There's also one called The Outward Mindset that gives you quite a bit more information as well.
If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll ask Patrick.
The first question from Debbie is, what if you are a supervisor with two coworkers who do this to each other? Well, a supervisor, first of all, in a leadership role, models behavior that they want to see in others. And so one of the things that I would probably try to do as a supervisor is first go outward myself, and then identify either one of the two to sit down with and say, you know, tell me what's going on with you. Tell me about your challenges and how I could be helpful. So you're going to use the same outward mindset pattern to try to break it. But what you're doing is you're setting a new tone with this person. And after you've done that for them and they can see how your outward mindset causes them to recognize that you can be more helpful and so forth, and how that works, then you can invite that person and say, look, I want you to try this with this other person. I want you to sit down with them and have this meet to get. You might have to explain a little bit more about it and say, well, I came across this stuff and I think it works great. It made a difference for me. And, you know, you don't have to stay in this kind of collusion forever. And here's the way you can break it. So that's the kind of way I would do it. So I'd model it first. Because it doesn't do any good to tell people something works if I haven't tried it myself. So that would be the thing that I would want to do. I'll make sure I'm getting all the questions. They're coming faster than I can answer them. So if we work with someone who clearly has an inward mindset, what can we do to help them? Again, same thing with peers. We're going to model that. You know, at first when you approach somebody with an inward mindset and you offer to be helpful like that, you can well imagine that they would be a little surprised. And maybe they'd even be a little suspicious. but the idea here is that you persist. And anything that we try to change, any kind of culture, organizational culture type of thing, isn't necessarily going to work the first time because people just don't operate that way. But it will have an impact if you keep doing it because they're gonna realize, wow, something's different here, and maybe they'll ask you, what the heck is going on? And then you can tell them a little bit more about the outward mindset and what is happening there. So you want to model it, and then when you model it and they ask about it, then you can give them more information. Okay. This definition of collusion that you're using seems significantly different from the traditional definition. And you talk about where this definition and use comes from. Is it in one of the books you referenced? Yes, it is. It's in both of the books that I referenced. And the idea here is, and I know what you're going for. Normally, collusion is seen as where people are conspiring. The word is kind of popular in the national news now, and it's sort of an underhanded thing. Well, if you think about it, this thing is a little bit underhanded because the way we're relating to each other isn't exactly honest. That we're interacting with another person and we're actually asking for the behaviors that are opposite of what we really want. But yes, it is a little bit different, and I was a little surprised when I first came across it, but it makes sense. The key here is we both have a part to play in this ongoing conflict, this ongoing inward mindset behavior justification, that nobody can say, well, I have no role in this. We all have a role in it. You mentioned a book with further information. Can you give the title and the author again? The title is Leadership and Self-Deception. The author is the Arbinger Institute. So they actually don't take individual credit for it. There's a group of people that have put this together. And the other book is simply called The Outward Mindset, put out by the Arbinger Institute, and you can find these on Amazon. Patrick asks, hi Patrick, good evening. What do you do if management appears to have an inward mindset? Well, even management is impacted by our behaviors and by our change in behavior. And so I would actually start approaching even a supervisor. Think about this. So I go to my manager, my immediate supervisor, and I say, I realize that I don't know enough about your objectives and what you're trying to accomplish as I could, because I can always learn more. And that's not your fault, that's mine. And so I am really curious. I want to know more about your objectives, your expectations, your challenges, and so forth. And you do the same thing, and then you think about ways that you could be more helpful, and you come back and say, well, what if I did this? Would this work better for you? Would that be more helpful? There's also a whole segment, which I wouldn't have time for, that talks about accountability with an outward mindset. And in this technique, if you would, we would actually evaluate ourselves in terms of how we're being helpful, how we're really contributing to the overall objective or the results of the organization. And then we would sit down and have the conversation with our boss, not like the traditional conversation where they sit us down and they tell us what they think of them. We initiate and say, here's how I'm doing in terms of impacting others, how I'm putting the effort into the areas as I understand them, and then say, these are the areas that I think I could work on, that I could be better at, and then ask them for their thoughts on it. Believe me, most managers would find this refreshing, that you're actually going and saying, no, I'm not going up there telling you I think I'm doing a lousy job. I'm saying I could do better because this is a reality. We can all always get better, and this is just an acknowledgement of that. So it's a way of essentially breaking the ice. And again, even if management's in an inward mindset, do you think they can stay there if you're approaching them that way? I would think probably not. The question here, how do you try to change justification when it's sort of embedded in the culture of a department? Well, like everything else, it begins with you. And so I would think the first thing you're going to have to do is identify your own justifications. Where have I done this? I know when I teach the workshop that by the time we get to the end of the first day especially, almost everybody says, oh my goodness, I can now see where I'm in a collusion, and here are my justifications, and that I've been in an inward mindset all this time. It's really quite an eye-opener for people, by the way. I'm quite blown away in some cases because it looks like the person's really digging in their heels and resisting what I'm trying to talk about, and all of a sudden they go, oh my goodness. And the other side of that is one of the key characters that we have videos for, other than Jim Farrell, his name is Chip Huth. Chip Huth is a SWAT commander, and he talks about when he first read the book, Leadership and Self-Deception, his initial reaction was, well, this is great. Now I have the answer of what's wrong with everybody else. And it took him a little while to realize, you know what? This book isn't about everyone else. This book is about me. And this is the only behavior that I can be responsible for. That's really quite a profound discovery for many people. I mean, you would think that we would know this quite automatically. Unfortunately, the answer to that is not necessarily. That we don't realize that we've been behaving in an inward mindset pattern. And in a way, I suppose, you are explaining what's going on with everybody else, because part of your justification, part of the process you're doing is bringing about those very behaviors that you don't want. That's the sobering part of this. The startling part of it in some cases, because you say, oh my goodness, there it is. I've been operating in an inward mindset and I didn't even know it. So again, the change begins with you. Sometimes we think, gosh, it's embedded in this whole department. There's no changing it. One of the interesting things about organizational change, transformation, is you actually don't have to get to the majority to see the tipping point, to see the point at which the whole organization is going to change. In fact, social science tells us we have to get to around 18 to 20% to hit the tipping point, and the whole organization begins to transform. And it doesn't have to start with the boss. Next question is, what do you say when you approach Jack to ask about his objectives, and he, a supervisor in this scenario, refuses to spend the time to talk to you? Well, that would be a little unusual, but maybe he's busy. And so one of the things you can do to be more helpful, because this is the whole theme, is say, okay, I can see that you're really busy right now. I think this is kind of important. So could we set up a time where we can talk about this, where I can give you the full attention that you deserve? So again, what we're doing is we're focusing on the other person's interests, the other person's objectives. So there might be a good reason that Jack doesn't want to spend the time with you right now. You know, he might have all kinds of irons in the fire. He's got things going on. And so this might be an inconvenience. So I wouldn't interpret that as necessarily resistance to the idea. I would interpret it more as there's probably a reason. We try to see the positive in folks and not the negative. And so in this case, we try to set up another time to have that discussion. I suppose if he continues to resist, then you have to kind of be okay in the fact that you've made the change and that you're getting yourself out of the box. You're not going to live in that inward mindset anymore. And I would say that it's extremely likely that most of the people around you will see this change and they will respond in kind, that you'll make progress somewhere. After a while, if this starts to happen, Jack's going to be the only one left that's not on board. And that typically compels a person to think about what the heck is going on. I don't see any other questions coming up, so let me try to kind of pull things together for everybody. Again, I know I hit you with a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. There's a lot more information about it. This is the kind of thing that I have been focused on for a number of years in working with organizations all over the place. And trust me, when people call me in to intervene for conflict, for communication challenges, for morale, it's not small stuff. They're usually big problems. And most of the time, I can say by using these techniques and others that I employ, I'm able to help them break through, and I see the change. I had a case not long ago where two people who work at a very small office, a 5-person office, had spoken to each other for 2 years. And I applied these techniques, and I ran into one of them about 6 months ago, and she said, you know what, we're the best of friends now, and we now try to be helpful for one another. We focus on that, and it's made all the difference in the world. And isn't that what we're about? Those of us in public service, we go into it not to make a million, but to make a difference. I would suggest to you that if you explore this outward mindset material, if you consider it, if you try it, you will do exactly that. You will make a difference. And if nothing else, you'll make a difference for yourself. Your self-image will be better, and people will find you an easier person to work with. And so don't expect to conquer the world, but expect to change your own behavior and have a better viewpoint of the world around you. That's really what it's all about. Changing the mindset, then you'll change the behaviors. So with that, I want to thank everybody for the attention and how pleased I am, how humbled I am to be able to work and offer what little I can to public servants everywhere, because I'm a big fan of public service. I was just telling a group this morning that a year from now, I will be in public service for 50 years.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Patrick. We really do appreciate this. I think everyone here has clearly been very engaged, and this has been a wonderful webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. This does conclude today's webinar. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time, and have a great day.